Hello and welcome. I'm your host, William Liu. You're listening to the Hello and Welcome podcast presented by Betway. This is our second time going live tonight from Hongqing because Raptors have just acquired Brandon Ingram from the New Orleans Pelicans. This has been widely reported in the week leading up to the trade deadline, and with less than 24 hours to go until Thursday's deadline, the Raptors have indeed landed the former All-Star from the New Orleans Pelicans. The trade here, full details as per Shams Charania of ESPN. Breaking, the New Orleans Pelicans have traded Brandon Ingram to the Toronto Raptors for Bruce Brown Jr., Kelly Olynyk, one first-round pick, and one second-rounder, sources tell ESPN. I've also been alerted that first-round pick, the details of that will be Indiana's 2026 first-round pick that the Raptors acquired as one of the pieces for the Pascal Siakam trade. Obviously, Bruce Brown, being the other part of the Pascal Siakam trade, goes out as the salary filler in this one, as the Raptors do indeed land Brandon Ingram. And I got to say, this is a really exciting moment when you think about the fact that the Raptors have not traded for a scorer like this, quite literally, since Kawhi Leonard. Now, of course, he is not on the level of Kawhi Leonard. We want to make this absolutely clear, but we are injecting a very, very talented player, somebody in Brandon Ingram who almost immediately walks into the Raptors right now as their most talented scorer. He is not a flawless player, and we'll get into that in just a bit. You know, clearly we've been looking into Brandon Ingram and the possibility of the Raptors acquiring him. But still, a very, very talented player who the Raptors have now acquired. Now, of course, the cost, we'll start with that first and foremost, because I felt like there was one of two potential packages that could have gone out to New Orleans for a potential Brandon Ingram trade. One package could have centered around R.J. Barrett, which was probably more of a one-for-one type of swap with the Pelicans getting R.J., but the other type, which the Raptors did have all the salary that they were expected to use to try to facilitate a potential Jimmy Butler trade, which also did go down tonight. But, of course, the Raptors pulled out of that one in terms of their ability to take on Kyle Anderson. Turns out some of that salary might have potentially been used in a trade like this as they traded for Ingram. But this was the other version of that, and probably the more likely, because RJ, he's had a really good season and he's done a really good job as a Raptor. There was no immediate need to trade him, especially for Ingram, who is now slated to get a new contract from the Raptors, assuming the Raptors do choose to re-sign him, which, by the way, if you make a trade like this, you definitely have already worked out, at least in rough terms, what the details of a potential re-signing would be. But you're giving up Kelly Olynyk, who unfortunately played his last game tonight. He at least got the tip-off against Zach Edey, who was in the starting lineup. We know that, Kelly was acquired to Toronto with the goal of him playing as a Raptor, giving the Raptors a 5-out center, maybe testing that out with other guys. I think he's been obviously a very loyal player to the Raptors, and he's always wanted to come home to play home. At the same time, when you get a chance to sort of like potentially add a player in Ingram, who will be in his prime right now, and if you re-sign him to like a 3-4 year deal, you will have him entirely for his prime. I think you got to, at least explore that possibility. And then Bruce Brown, we all know that Bruce Brown wasn't going to stay in Toronto. I think there were talks that Bruce Brown could potentially, he talked about he wanted to be here. That's fine. But ultimately, at the same time, the Raptors go out there and acquire Ingram. So a couple of things to note right away. Number one, I think it signals that the Raptors, as something that's been telegraphed by the broadcast. Matt Devlin's talked about this several times. If you hear the Raptors on the broadcast, the Raptors front office, their intention is to be contending for the playoffs and being a competitive team again in the Eastern Conference next season. Now, that's regardless of what happens in the draft here, because the Raptors could still potentially continue down this path where they're on, line to get a really, really good pick out of this year's draft. Even acquiring Brandon Ingram for this season, we'll even see if his availability is there. He's only played 18 games this season, owing in large part to an ankle injury. We'll see sort of if they continue to hold him out and the Raptors continue to play in the draft. I don't want to rule that possibility out. But I think what's pretty clear is the Raptors really, as recently as next year, with this season and this team in place, they want to be able to sort of go for it and get back to being a competitive team that chases for the playoffs starting next year. And when you bring in a player like Brandon Ingram, I think that clearly signals that intention. Now, of course, we got to see what other potential moves are made. We still don't know if there are more trades to be made, because there is still enough time here until the trade deadline that takes place tomorrow afternoon. But still, for time being, the Raptors add Brandon Ingram. Now, I think I don't have to explain to too many people what Brandon Ingram is because he's been in the league for several years here. Obviously, he was a number 2 overall pick out of Duke going to the Lakers. He was kind of, even at Duke, kind of hailed as like a baby Durant, kind of a mini Durant kind of situation. Suddenly a lanky forward, very, very silky, smooth game. He obviously can knock down pull-up jumpers, really, really strong in the mid-range, and he's done that at the NBA level. Obviously, he goes from the Lakers to the Pelicans as part of the Anthony Davis trade. He becomes one of many stars for the Pelicans. And, of course, the Pelicans have been, mostly underwhelming. They have up years, they have down years. They did win 49 games last year. But also at the same time, I think that it's kind of been a more of a confusing situation with the Pelicans. And so even though he's a clearly very talented player, it never necessarily felt like his star rose to that level of like number 2 overall pick, also a Kevin Durant clone. At the same time, though, let's not get it twisted. Brandon Ingram this season, and again, he's only played 18 games because of the injury, it was averaging 22.2 points per game, 5.6 rebounds, 5.2 assists, and you got him by flipping off of Bruce Brown, Kelly Olynyk, and 1 first-round pick that isn't even yours. That's Indiana's 2026 first-round pick. And honestly, with the Pacers as is right now, I don't see the Pacers like falling out entirely and becoming a terrible team in 2026, especially based on the players that they have under contract. So it wasn't going to be, and it probably most likely will not be a lottery pick, that pick. And so when you're getting the chance to acquire him right now, which obviously you maybe could wait till free agency, although the Raptors don't have that much cap space, like you would need probably $35 million. I feel like that's probably the contract where it starts for Ingram when he re-signs this summer. But this is how the NBA works. Messiah's talked about it. This is pre-agency. You got to trade for a player before they even hit the free agency market itself, and that's what we're seeing here with Ingram. Ingram's a very talented player. Like, there's a very, very talented player. And I think the argument here is how good is he already, and how can the Raptors get an even higher level out of him? And, of course, I think, what gives me promise with a guy like Ingram is like what the Raptors have done, for example, with RJ Barrett. When the Raptors acquired RJ at this time last year in the OG Anunoby trade, it was not considered like a big splashy move. It was cool that RJ was coming home, and we liked that homecoming angle, but I think he was more underwhelming with the Knicks. To be clear, Ingram has been way better as a Pelican than RJ was as a Knick. That's not even a comparison. But I think what the Raptors were able to do with the RJ acquisition was sort of like take a player from one context and put him in another. And what we saw with RJ was he was able to play more efficiently. He was able to be put in the right spots, take away some of the stuff that he's not good at, and just present a better version, a more optimized version. I think a similar thing could happen with Brandon Ingram. I actually covered this on an episode of a previous episode here on the Hello Welcome podcast with co-host Alex Wong, where we sort of circled back to the idea of Brandon Ingram. It was after the Knicks game where we talked about the possibility of the Raptors getting Ingram because it sounded like there was a lot more momentum behind the deal. And the more I thought about it, I was like, look, he's already a really talented player, right? We're talking about one of the best players in the league from the mid-range area. Like, we're excited right now for that Scotty has developed a lot in the mid-range. Well, I think Ingram is a player that has been good in the mid-range pretty much his entire career. I mean, when you look at his percentages, some of the numbers just don't even look right. Like, the last 4 seasons, he shot 54%, 51%, 52%, and 51% from the mid-range area between 10 to 16 feet for 4 seasons running. Like, that's outrageous efficiency. That's like Dirk-level efficiency from that kind of distance. I think that's really, really promising. Now, of course, he's so good in the mid-range area that he's one of those players that probably takes a few too many twos and doesn't take as many threes. The thing is, he's actually a really strong three-point shooter, right? Overall, the percentages are 36% this year, for example. Again, only in 18 games, but he shot 37%. Clearly, anyone who's watched Brandon Ingram play at any level knows that he's a really good shooter. And I think that if the Raptors are able to get him to shoot more threes, maybe cut down a little bit off the mid-range, he's still very efficient at the rim. He's still a really good playmaker as well. You teach him to play a little bit more off ball. Like, there's a very real chance that the Raptors optimize and get a better version of Brandon Ingram. But even if they get Brandon Ingram as is, that's still a really good player. Like, we're talking about a perennial 20-point-per-game guy who's able to get to his own shot, who's able to, distribute and create for others. I think his playmaking has come up in the last couple of years. Last couple of seasons, he's averaged 5.7 assists, 5.8 assists, 5.6 assists. Like, a playmaking forward who can get his own shot. I think you can totally see what the idea here is for the Raptors. Now, of course, the big question is going to be what the contract's going to look like. And again, part of the reason he's leaving the Pelicans is because of the fact that they were unable to reach a contract extension. He had changed agencies in the middle of this season, joining Clutch Sports with under Rich Paul. Of course, if you actually look at his agents, one of them is Mike George, who has joined Clutch Sports this season. That's a long-time Toronto-based area agent. I wonder if there was a connection there in terms of making him available. But I think from the Raptors side, it was like, look, if he's going to cost you expiring veteran salaries in Bruce Brown, Kelly Olynyk, and a 2026 Indiana pick, and you get a chance to add a player in his prime who is, again, who's able to create his own offense, who's able to shoot and be a true three-level scorer, and he's also able to distribute, and there's still a little bit more upside. I think that the Raptors looked at the situation and thought, you know what? We obviously are trying to go for the best possible lottery pick here. We also obviously have to figure out who's going to be the odd man out in the starting lineup because it will bump somebody out of that group. But more than anything else, I think for the price and the talent level, it's a pretty easy trade to make a case for. It's not a slam dunk just yet. I think you would need to see him make a couple more improvements to make it an absolute slam dunk. But I think more than anything else, this signals that the Raptors are indeed willing and intending to compete for, back for the playoffs again next year. We got the details here, courtesy of Jerome Chang, by way of Josh Lewenberg. The Raptors are sending Indiana's top 4 protected 2026 first-round pick to New Orleans as part of the Brandon Ingram trade, according to a leaked source. And, yeah, I mean, I think that what this really says is basically the Raptors had the chance here to continue with the team as is before, which was Scotty Barnes, Emmanuel Quickley, R.J. Barrett, Jakob Poeltl, and the fifth starter was Pascal Siakam. There was a period between the OJ Anunoby trade, which took place on the 28th of December, and then they were able to flip Pascal Siakam about a month later. There was a period when those guys all played together. But, of course, the Raptors did not seem enthusiastic about re-signing Pascal last summer, and that was all the reporting that I heard as well in terms of just like, the Raptors kind of had the contract offer on the table, but took it off the table, put it on the table, off the table. It just never felt like it was a serious thing to retain Pascal Siakam, so they ultimately traded him to Indiana. I think what they've done with the Indiana assets, especially now looking back at the Pascal Siakam trade, if you look at the total of it and you go from, you can either have re-signed Pascal, who I think, by the way, is a slightly better player than Brandon Ingram, right? To be clear, Pascal is an all-star this year. He's playing really well. He's a really, really good player. There's no doubt about that. I have all the respect in the world for Pascal. But you could have re-signed Pascal, or with that trade that they made for Pascal, they have now since been able to acquire, as downstream effects of that trade, Ochai Agbaji, who has turned into a promising two-way player for the Raptors, very steady player, probably ultimately a bench player, but pretty steady two-way player that has joined your program. Under cost control, you can choose to re-sign him if you want to. They have acquired, a first-round pick that they flipped, again, into Kelly Olynyk and Ochai Agbaji. They've been able to turn more of those assets into a Davion Mitchell, into Jamal Shed. Again, these are more minor pieces, but again, these are just little offshoots that they've been able to sort of acquire from that trade as part of that trade tree. And now you flip kind of the remaining assets of that. Bruce Brown's contract, Kelly Olynyk's contract, which again was acquired kind of as a downstream effect, and that Indiana pick, you flip it to New Orleans now for Brandon Ingram, who is younger than Pascal. We'll have to say that much. He is 3 years younger than Pascal Siakam. So it is a confusing kind of thing, quite frankly. If you ask me who's better between the two of them right now, I would say Pascal. But at the same time, Ingram brings you a lot of elements that are pretty exciting. And I think, once again, this means the front office does not intend to go on a long-term rebuild. They do not intend to sort of like be bad again next year and play for the lottery. Significant things will have to go wrong. Right now, as it stands, the Raptors starting 5 would actually look pretty good. Like, you have Emmanuel Quickley, when healthy, clearly a very good player. At your point guard, R.J. Barrett, who has shown a new level of efficiency and playmaking here in Toronto since joining here from the Knicks. Brandon Ingram as your 3, Scotty Barnes as your 4, and Jakob Poeltl as your 5. Like, that's a pretty solid starting 5. Plus, you do have more depth on the bench now. And, of course, I forgot to mention, but they also got Jacoby Walter, who was able to be acquired as part of that trade because that was Indiana's pick that the Raptors also acquired from Pascal's trade. So, honestly, at the time of the trade, and certainly I'm going to own up to it because it looked underwhelming at the time. It didn't feel like we got full value. But in the subsequent trades that they have made since, this has actually turned in, for me, a better outcome for the Raptors. So I got to give the Raptors front office that credit. Now, of course, they still got to re-sign him. The number is still pretty important. And the new CBA and all that kind of stuff, the Raptors are about to get expensive really quickly, right? RJ, for example, could be up for an extension this summer. Jakob Poeltl could be up for an extension this summer. We got to see how it goes. And I think the other part, too, is are the Raptors going to suddenly be more competitive this year? The schedule, as we know, is already the easiest remaining schedule in the NBA for the remainder of the season. So there's already a chance of the Raptors rebounding with more wins towards the end of the season. But if you bring in Ingram, how many games is he going to play for you down the stretch? Don't you want to use some of this time to see how it all mixes together before you obviously re-sign him for a pretty big number in the summer? Those are all questions, and it makes me more intrigued to watch and cover the Raptors for the remainder of the season. But as of right now, the Raptors add Brandon Ingram, and they ship off veteran pieces that they were not going to re-sign or they were not going to keep long-term, and one first-round pick that they got as an offshoot from Indiana in the first place that I don't think is a lottery pick. Like, I don't really see why people can be particularly upset about that. Now, granted, this whole thing has to still gel. It still has to come together. You know, we're still talking about a team that is firmly in the tanking race that is now suddenly talking about being competitive next year. But again, the best case scenario, for me at least, is Raptors continue to drop games towards the end of this year, right? They come out of the lottery with some luck. Don't forget the year the Raptors picked Scottie in the 2021 draft class. They were 7th in terms of the record at the bottom, but they moved up to get to 4. To grab a guy like Scottie Barnes. Can you grab a significant piece and add a lottery pick in addition to a starting 5 that, once again, I'll say, Emmanuel Quickly, RJ Barrett, Brandon Ingram, Scottie Barnes, Jakob Poeltl. Like, those are 5 pretty good players right there. Now, of course, like, it is just an if, but at least on paper, the Raptors look a lot more set up, I think, for the future. And I know the initial reaction I thought when we first got the rumors was like, this is out of nowhere. Is Ingram specifically that guy? But I also think that if you are skeptical about this, and not to say that it's irrational to be skeptical, I don't think that that's the case, but I would advise you, at least, if you want to feel better about it, if you are one of the people that's not as excited about it, go watch some Brandon Ingram tape and just watch the level of talent that's right there. And I think that there's maybe a more optimal version that you put him in the Raptors system. The Raptors obviously, have a much more structured offense as compared to what New Orleans has had over the years. I think that, there's more ball movement here. I think that, there's things that Ingram has to do, like shoot more threes, like, be more willing to play off ball and be more effective playing off ball. But we've seen so many players join the Raptors in the last couple of years that have developed more of that skill set. So hopefully that's what happens here. But more than anything else, it's pretty exciting. I mean, again, you think back to like all the trades that the Raptors have made, Ingram is a very talented player. I'll just say that much, right? Like, he's, again, not Kawhi Leonard. Nothing will come close to the Kawhi Leonard trade, but, it's probably somewhere on the level of like Raps trading for Serge. Actually, honestly, Ingram's better than what Serge was at that time. Like all the trades that they made recently, like they've made good trades in terms of like Graves Vasquez for like some lottery picks, and they're able to turn those into OG and Norm, and so that's looked really good in hindsight. But at least for immediate talent, like this is a really talented player that they've acquired here. So yeah, I mean, I'm pretty excited, man, and I think that just based on the audience here, I mean, I'm seeing over 5,000 people watching live right now across YouTube and Twitter. That's really exciting. I can see that there's excitement there from the audience as well, and yeah, for the Raptors, like they've actually hopped in here and acquired a really talented scorer. I think maybe best case scenario, I'll give you best case scenario and worst case scenario. How about that? Best case scenario, Brandon Ingram comes in. He slots in as something of your primary option, your go-to scorer in a late game, for example. It's a tie game down the stretch. You need somebody to get you a bucket. You're turning the ball over. You're giving it to Brandon Ingram. I mean, that's already an upgrade over what they're doing right now in terms of who's going to be the late game closer for you. Okay, he's certainly better than RJ in that respect. And as much as Scottie has been effective in fourth quarters, I think that the level of shot creation with Ingram is just a significant level ahead of what Scottie does right now. I think that also it's another guy who it can really shoot the ball, can really sort of bring some size to your lineup, maybe switch a little bit. Defensively, that's the aspect I haven't talked that much about. I don't think he's necessarily like a dominant defender. He's not like a switchable, like, put him on anybody, he shuts everyone down. This is not OG on defense. But at the same time, I would say he's probably like around average, and he's got the size to be disruptive, at least with his length and activity. Primarily his value is going to be on offense, so I don't want to oversell the defense. But I still think that like if he's knocking, for example, a Grady Dick out of the starting lineup, he's certainly better on defense than Grady Dick. And quite frankly, probably better than Grady will ever be defensively. So I think that on that end, it's also an upgrade for what the team needs right now, or at least what they need next season, because that's what the Raptors are looking at first and foremost. So like best case scenario, you get end of game closer. You get a guy who can create his own offense. You get a 3-level scorer, and not somebody who's going to take all your shots because you're still going to run a pretty balanced offense here. But still somebody who on any given night could be your leading scorer. Him and RJ and Scotty. That's 3 guys who can give you 20 plus. I think quickly can more naturally play a sort of a point guard position. Quite frankly, there's almost I wouldn't say there's so much scoring, but like it doesn't. You don't need as much from IQ after a trade like this. And, I think that's the best case scenario. So, like, if everything works out absolutely perfectly, he learns to play more off ball, he's moving and cutting, and they're bringing a higher level out of him, that's great. Worst case scenario, it could be something similar to a Rudy Gay situation. It kind of crowds out your backcourt in terms of, like, you have, at that time you had Kyle and DeMar. And you were adding Rudy Gay to that situation. They were also trying to chase for the playoffs because they were kind of having a down year. Of course, the following year it didn't work out. Chemistry-wise, it wasn't good. There's too much overlap for that team between Rudy and DeMar in particular. You could argue that Scotty right now, his best scoring weapon is the mid-range shot. Now you add another high-volume mid-range player. Do they crowd each other out? There's a possibility of that. I'll have to say, though, Ingram is a significantly better three-point shooter than Rudy Gay was. But still, again, I'm going best case scenario, worst case scenario. It could be a bad fit on that front, and in that sense that, like, you can have to force yourself into make more pivot moves down the stretch. But if I had to lean between if they're closer to the best case or the worst case, I think they're closer to the best case. So those are my initial thoughts on this trade. I want to say that, Bruce Brown and Kelly Olynyk, those guys obviously have served the Raptors well in their short times here, and they weren't here for a lot of wins, but they were pretty solid vets for a team that, has really needed some sort of guidance in that stretch. They were never going to be here long term, but at the same time, they played well. They're professionals. So I do want to say a thank you to those guys for playing for the Raptors, and I'm sure we'll see them in the future. But ultimately, the Raptors for now have to look to their own future because, again, they've acquired Brandon Ingram. And as far as, win now trades in terms of the talent, I mean, this is pretty damn good. So I'm really curious to see, again, what other trades happen from now until the end of the trade deadline. This has already been a pretty crazy one. I mean, Raptors acquiring Brandon Ingram is not even a top 5 craziest trade that's happened at this deadline alone. But for the Raptor fans, it is going to be really exciting. So I'm curious to see, again, tomorrow the front office will speak. We'll get a chance to hear what they're saying about the team, what they intend to do, if they still want to get a top pick out of this draft. But, at the same time, if you are curious and wondering like what's happening with this team, just search some Brandon Ingram highlights. Actually, I'll even give you a little starter. Watch Brandon Ingram's performance last year. He had like 40 against the Raptors. And I know it was last year's Raptors team, which was pretty terrible, but you just watch the shot making in that one and try to envision that, but as a member of the Raptors. So exciting stuff. We'll have more coverage of it tomorrow. Once again, I'll remind everybody that we'll be going live 2 p.m. tomorrow afternoon Eastern from NBA Courtside Restaurant at 15 Queens Quay. We will get to live trade coverage of the last couple hours of the trade deadline, and we'll give you more analysis and thoughts on Brandon Ingram. But that's what we have for now. And I know a lot of people were asking, where was co-host Alex Wong? He was just in here with you a moment ago doing a Raptors-Grizzlies reaction podcast. We actually do have some footage of what Alex has been doing as I've been giving you breathless reactions here. He is eating, for those curious, those are the Mala wings here at Hongsheng. They are the number 1 wing in the city, bar none. And he was enjoying those wings when I've been enjoying the Raptors adding a wing of their own in Brandon Ingram. So exciting stuff. Once again, go watch some Brandon Ingram highlights, and we'll gather again tomorrow at 2 p.m. to break it down a little bit further. But thanks everyone for listening. This has been the Home Welcome Podcast presented by Betway.